In this webinar, we'll take a brief look at the process of setting up security, defining users and roles and groups, and setting permissions. These topics generally pertain to an administrator, although some of the topics that we'll cover here will also be of use for designers. To configure security for the server, open the server administration tool called Enterprise Manager. The default login for Enterprise Manager is username admin and password admin. To configure security, expand the server node under the main server tab and open the security page. If security is turned off, check the Enable Security option. Security is broken up into two different aspects, authentication and authorization. Authentication is the process of determining the identity of the user logging in, and authorization is the process of assigning relevant permissions to that user. For both the authentication and authorization process, you can select either the default file security provider, which is a built-in security provider, or an Ldap security provider, which utilizes third-party Ldap software such as Active Directory to supply the user's groups and roles. If you do not already have an Ldap server in use, you may consider using the default security provider for both authentication and for authorization. If you are using an Ldap security provider such as Active Directory, you may find it more convenient to use the Ldap server for authentication. Note that you will need to enter some connection settings so that the Style Intelligence server can connect to the Ldap server to retrieve user, group, and role information. Even if you are using your Ldap server for authentication, you may still wish to leave the authorization aspect of the security provider set to default. This will allow the Style Intelligence server to manage all of the permissions for the different assets in the repository and different operations that the user can do on the server. As I mentioned, you can also use an Ldap server for authorization. However, this will require making changes to the Ldap schema, and in many cases this is not desirable. Therefore, it is common to use the Ldap option for authentication, but the default file security provider for authorization. If you are using the Ldap option for authentication, then your users, groups, and roles will need to be defined in your Ldap software. If you are using the default security provider for authentication, then the users, groups, and roles will be defined under the Users tab. Let's take a look at the Users tab and see how we can set up users, groups, and roles. To create a new user, find the New User link at the bottom of the left panel. Press the link to create a new user. In this case, we'll create a user named Eric. Enter the username. You can specify whether the user is currently active or not. This option allows you to deactivate users, for example, when a user temporarily leaves the company but might come back at a later time. After we create some groups and roles, we'll see that users can be assigned to different groups and users can be assigned different roles. You can also specify an email and a default locale for the user. After specifying the user information, simply press Apply to create the new user. Users are listed in the left panel under the Users folder. To create a new group, press the New Group link at the bottom of the left panel. Provide a name for the group. And then add any users to the group either by using the menus here or by clicking and dragging users from the list on the left. In this case, I'll just add some users by using the menu. Annie and Eric. Always remember to press the Apply button after making any changes in Enterprise Manager. Note that under the Users folder now, there is a list of users under the group called Third Floor. To create a new role, press the New Role link at the bottom of the left panel. Enter a name for the new role. And again, assign the role to different users. In this case, we'll assign the role of engineer to Eric and Robert. Again, press Apply to save the settings. The new role is displayed in the Roles folder. When you're editing a user, for example, editing the user Robert, you can also add groups by dragging groups from the left panel to the table here, or by selecting the groups in the menu, and you can add roles by dragging roles from the roles folder in the left panel to the roles table in the user page. To set permissions for reports and dashboards and for other assets, use the Report tab and the Objects tab. Under the Report tab, you can specify permissions for folders in the repository as well as for dashboards and for reports. To set permissions for a folder, select the folder and then choose the Security tab. And note that by default, the option set is to use parent permissions. This means that the folder is inheriting its permissions from its parent folder, and you can click on the parent folder to see what those permissions are. In this case, the tutorial folder is one level below the main repository folder. So by selecting the main repository folder, you can discover that, in fact, access to the contents of these folders is currently being denied to all users. To set a custom permission setting for a folder, select the folder, then turn off Use Parent Permissions, and then assign permissions as desired to users, roles, or groups. For example, to assign permission to a user named Robert, drag Robert from the left panel into the right panel, and then choose the desired read, write, and delete permissions. This will set the permissions for the tutorial folder, giving Robert the appropriate access to the contents of that folder. To assign permission to a role, follow the same procedure. Expand the roles list and drag the desired role from the left panel into the right panel. Again, choose the desired read, write, and delete permissions for the folder, and then press Apply. To set permissions on an individual dashboard or an individual report, find the report or dashboard that you want to set permissions for. For example, here's a dashboard called Sales Analysis. Select the Security tab for the particular dashboard, and then again, turn off the Use Parent Permissions option. Drag a user or a group or role into the right panel, set the desired read, write, and delete permissions, and press Apply. Users who have read permission for an asset, for example, a dashboard or a report, will be able to see that dashboard or report when they log into the portal. They'll be able to click on it to open it. If a user has write permission, then the user will be able to make modifications to the asset, for example, to open a dashboard in Visual Composer and to save changes to the dashboard. Note that this also requires access to the Visual Composer, which has a separate permission setting, which we'll discuss shortly. If a user has delete permission, they'll be able to delete the selected asset. In many cases, you may find it useful to set up folders in the repository along the lines of the permissions that you intend to assign users. In other words, if you have a set of users that should have permissions to one set of dashboards and another group of users that has permissions to a different set of dashboards, it may be easiest to create folders in the repository and then assign the appropriate permissions to the folders rather than to the individual dashboards. To create a new folder in the repository, click on the folder in which you want to create a new folder, and then press the New Folder link at the bottom of the panel. This creates a new folder called Folder 1. To change the name, select the Property tab at the top and provide a name for the folder. To move assets from one folder into another folder, simply click and drag on them in the repository tree. For example, to move the Sales Analysis dashboard from the Dashboards folder into the new folder, simply drag it into the new folder. So far we've discussed setting permissions for folders in the repository and for individual reports and dashboards. To set permissions for other assets and for behaviors that the user is permitted to do in the user portal, use the Objects tab at the top. Click on the Objects tab and then expand the list in the left panel. Let's review some of the permissions that you can set under the Objects tab. At the top, you can manage permissions for various data sources. For example, you can set permissions for the sample orders data source, which is a relational database, or you can set permissions for queries that have been defined on that data source or data models that have been defined on that data source. The procedure for setting permissions for all of these is the same. Select the particular asset for which you want to assign permissions, in this case the order details query, then deselect the Use Parent Permissions option, and assign permissions to users, groups, or roles as we showed before. The permissions that you set for these data source related assets will generally affect designers of data worksheets and of dashboards. That is, when a user logs in and opens the Visual Composer to design a data worksheet or a dashboard, the data sources that they have available to themselves will be controlled by the permissions that you set here. Access to data worksheets is very much the same. Expand the Global Worksheet node, and then to assign permissions to a folder or to an individual worksheet, select the asset, deselect Use Parent Permissions, and then assign permissions based on user, group, or role. The permissions that you assign to these worksheets will determine which data worksheets are available for dashboard designers to use as a data source. The library folder relates to the contents of the styled report.srl file, which contains all of the reusable components for reports. These include beans, meta templates, parameter sheets, scripts, and table styles. When Style Studio is using a server-based repository, you can control access to these assets by using the permissions settings here. For example, to set permission for a particular meta template, select the meta template, and then repeat the process of assigning permissions for that meta template to users, groups, or roles. This will only affect users of the Style Studio desktop development tool when security is turned on in that tool. The permission settings for the bookmark option determine whether individual users, groups, or roles can create and share bookmarks in dashboards. The Edit Dashboard option allows you to set permissions for which users are able to assign dashboards to the User Portal Dashboard tab. Note that this setting does not control the ability of the user to edit dashboards in Visual Composer. The Enterprise Manager permission settings are intended for a multi-tenant environment, where there may be multiple administrators logging into Enterprise Manager. Here, permissions can be set to access the various options within Enterprise Manager, such as the Audit tab, the Data Space tab, the Log tab, and so on. Permissions for the export options determine which users, groups, and roles will have access to which methods of exporting reports. By default, reports can be exported in any of these formats. However, if you wish to limit the number of formats based on user, group, or role, you can set permissions here. Permissions for the My Reports action determine whether a given user, group, or role will have access to the My Reports folder in the repository. Permissions for the Physical Table action determine whether the user will have access to the physical database tables when they are creating data worksheets or dashboards. Permission settings for the various portal tabs determine which user, groups, or roles have access to those tabs in the portal. If a user does not have access to a tab, the tab simply does not appear in the portal. Permissions for report design pertain again to the Style Studio desktop development tool when security is turned on in that tool. The import and export action determines whether users, groups, and roles have permission to import and export assets from the Style Studio environment when the server repository option is in use. Likewise, the Style Studio Local and Style Studio Remote options control the ability of users to execute reports either locally or remotely when Style Studio is set up to use a server repository. Options under the Report Toolbar action allow you to customize the buttons in a report toolbar on a user-by-user, role-by-role, or group-by-group basis. Most of the buttons are displayed by default. However, if you wish to suppress certain buttons based on user group or role, you can set that permission here. Schedule options pertain to the options that are available when a user schedules a dashboard or a report for automatic generation and delivery. The options that will be available to the user are options for which they have permission, and you can set that permission based on user group or role here. Analogous to the Report Toolbar options, here you can also set permission for the Viewsheet Toolbar options. Viewsheet Toolbar is the dashboard toolbar that appears by default. If you wish to suppress certain buttons in the toolbar based on user group or role, you can make those permission settings here. Finally, to control access to Visual Composer for designing dashboards or for designing worksheets, you can use the Visual Composer Viewsheet and Visual Composer Worksheet actions here. For example, if you want only particular users to be able to design dashboards, set permissions for Visual Composer Viewsheet. If you want only certain users to be able to design worksheets, set permissions for Visual Composer Worksheet. To summarize, to set permissions for the contents of the repository, that is, folders in the repository, reports, and dashboards, use the Report tab at the top. To set permissions for all other actions and assets, use the Objects tab at the top. Note that the permission settings that we've been discussing here do not allow you to filter data based on user group or role at the row level or column level of the raw data. To implement user, role, or group-based filtering on the data level, you should use a VPM, or Virtual Private Model. Please see the documentation for more information about virtual private models and how they can be used to implement user, role, and group-based filtering.